Good evening, everybody. Thanks for staying for the keynote talk, our last session for today. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Glenn Hartelius. He's the director of the Integral and Transpersonal Psychology program at the School of Consciousness and Transformation, the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, California. He will talk today about body maps of attention, how a whole person approach may inform the neuroscience of mindfulness. Glenn earned his Ph.D. from the California Institute of Integral Studies, his MA from Loma Linda University, and the BA from Pacific Union College. And Glenn is focused to bringing whole person approaches closer to neuroscience. His concept of what attention is and how to manage it within oneself is designed to simplify complex skills such as meditation, sustained focus, and also leadership presence. He's the founding director of a new online Ph.D. program in Integral and Transpersonal Psychology at CIIS in San Francisco, where he also serves as associate professor of the East-West Psychology Department. He's also leading an initiative.
We can't hear you at all back here. Yeah, you don't have your mic on.
I don't know. I stand in the middle of the room. Is that better? Yeah. He's also leading an initiative to develop a new research facility at CIIS for research in whole person neuroscience. Glenn is the main editor of the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies. He's also the co-editor of the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Transpersonal Psychology, and the secretary of the International Transpersonal Association. His research on definition and scope of transpersonal psychology has helped to define the field. And here a few words about transpersonal psychology, which is a special psychology. It's an approach to psychology that studies phenomena beyond the ego as context for an integrative and holistic psychology. And this provides the framework for understanding and cultivating human transformation. So there's cognitive behavioral psychology, which has studied mindfulness in therapy or counseling settings in context of mental disorder, stress reduction, and enhancement of health. But transpersonal psychology really adds a different element to it. It looks at it from a different angle that is also informed from seeing beyond the ego and seeing at it, looking at it from an integrative and holistic point of view. So today we are delighted to learn more about mindfulness as an embodied practice seen through the lens of transpersonal psychology. And thank you very much, Glenn, for coming all the way from California to give this talk. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Everyone still holding up, staying awake? All right, so whole person approach to the neuroscience and mindfulness. So what I hope that you will get from this is really mindfulness as something that can bring something unexpected to psychology, not just something that can fit within the parameters of what psychology has always done, but can help to challenge the boundaries of psychology and open it up in new ways, and also to open up your experience of yourself in new ways. And in order to do this, we may need to put on some corrective lenses. Now, you'll notice that I also wear corrective lenses, and that's actually not because I can't see without my glasses. It's because I suffer from a common but debilitating medical condition known as male refrigerator blindness. And when I look into the refrigerator, I am not able to distinguish individual objects and find the things that are right in front of me. Now, in the same way, the study of mindfulness you need to pay attention to things that may be right in front of you in your experience, but that you may not notice. So we will try to offer you the corrective lenses so that you begin to notice the things that are immediately present and how they relate to mindfulness. So in this presentation, what I would cue you to listen for is not all kinds of mindfulness are the same. Mindfulness is not just a cognitive process, it is a state of consciousness. And mindfulness most profoundly is a different way of being you. It is not a different thing that you do. It changes the ground from which you are doing. Now, there's been a lot of research in the last 15 years on mindfulness, and we know that it has benefits for health, stress, negative emotions, attention, anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. But at the same time, with all of this research, there is still a challenge in defining what exactly mindfulness is. So what I hope you to come away from today's session with is a clear conceptual understanding and a clear experiential understanding of mindfulness as a state of consciousness that is different from just a different way of using your mind. Because there are different types of practice that go under the name mindfulness, even if they are not necessarily identical. You can say, yes, I want to live in the moment, and then say, well, but how about some other moment? And use it as an excuse for dissociating, for spacing out. That's not mindfulness. Part of the challenge is that we have two traditions of definition. One is the practitioner definition, experiential descriptions that are influenced by teachings, mainly from Buddhist traditions, but also from various other traditions. And we have a psychological tradition of definition that has descriptions of cognitive information processing. Practitioner definitions are not precise enough psychologically, and psychological definitions are often not precise enough experientially. So we have this gap. So let's go to the psychological definitions. Jon Kabat-Zinn, of course, has done wonderful work with bringing mindfulness to attention and starting a process that has led to the amount of research that we have now. And his definition is that mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. That's good. It's a nice summary definition. Then you have various psychological measures that have been developed, and several of these were combined into the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, which is about the best measure we have right now. And the 5 facets have been defined as observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judging of inner experience, and non-reactivity to inner experience. Again, a nice summary of relevant sort of processes. And notice that these are in the language of cognitive process, where you are doing something different with your ability to think. But mindfulness may be more than a shift in cognitive process. It may be a shift from cognitive process. And that's where the existing psychological language leaves us wanting. How do we develop a language for the shift from cognitive process? So I want to just kind of make some distinctions here, because the term mindfulness is used in a variety of ways. First, there's traditional mindfulness. Now, if you lived in a traditional society and you said, well, I want to learn mindfulness, what would you do? Anybody? Would you go down to the rec center for an hour and a half on Tuesday nights and take mindfulness classes? What would you do? You would give up your daily life, your job, living with your family, and you would go and live in a monastic community. So none of what we're talking about in our society is traditional mindfulness. We have two other types. One I like to call cognitive behavioral mindfulness, and one is neo-traditional mindfulness. Cognitive behavioral involves deliberate acceptance and committed action. Neo-traditional mindfulness involves a state of non-conceptual witnessing of process. In this cognitive behavioral version, you are using your will to do things that are consistent with descriptions of mindfulness. In the neo-traditional, you are entering a state of consciousness in which those conditions are natural. Now, they're both good. They can both be useful for different things, but they are not the same thing. For example, cognitive behavioral mindfulness. Some of the techniques that are used, observing thoughts as if from outside. So let's try this. I want you to just notice right now. What's your experience like? What's a thought that's going through your head? What's the little voice inside saying? What do you mean, what's a thought? It's probably saying something like that. A thought? Do I have to think of a thought? That's a good enough one right there. So capture that thought. Hold that thought in your mind and look at it as if you were outside of that thought. Now, take that thought, and let's just do this together. Just repeat that thought out loud. We'll just all talk about it. Okay, I think I have a thought now. Okay, I think I have a thought now. Come on, join me. Okay, whatever your thought is, just say your thought. Just speak that thought over and over again. And you can see how after a little while you kind of lose connection to the meaning of the thought. All right? Now think of something in your past that you kind of maybe kick yourself about just a little bit. Nothing big, just kind of like, oh, yeah, I wish I'd done that a little better. It's probably not too hard to find that. Now what I'd like you to do is just open your mind and go, you know what? That's how it is. I accept, just intentionally embrace that event and saying, that's what happened, I accept it, just as an experiment. Okay? So those are the kinds of techniques that are used in a cognitive behavioral version of mindfulness. You don't have to shift to a different state of mind, but you can use these helpful tools to change your experience. Good tools. In neo-traditional mindfulness, which basically takes some of the verbal formulas that come from some of these traditional communities and offer them for an hour and a half in the rec center on Tuesday night. And The goal is to induce a different state of consciousness, a state in which the observer is not the familiar sense of yourself, but rather a quiet moment-to-moment awareness that is present to bodily sensations rather than to the story that you tell yourself about who you are. Yet at this moment, these two approaches, when they do like a meta-analysis, which is like taking a bunch of studies and putting them together and saying, okay, we can see how much impact there is of mindfulness. These two are being lumped together, in part because all we have is the language of cognitive process. And when you put both of these into cognitive process language, it sounds like they're the same thing. Besides, they both have the same name, mindfulness. The study that I'm going to show here, I'm just going to bottom line it for you, which is they had two groups of people. One group that was just people coming in off the street, and another group that had just finished an 8-week mindfulness training. And they were given two exercises. I'm going to ask you to do those two exercises now. The first is, think about yourself in the third person. Think about yourself as, oh, yeah, right, I'm picturing myself as if I were outside, okay? And when these two groups did that, they both had, when they put them in fMRIs, their brain activity was the same. Okay, now instead of thinking about yourself, I'd like you just kind of be aware of yourself right here and right now. Be aware of yourself in this moment. Now, when they had people do that, people who had not had meditation training, their brain waves did not change. Where they activated in their brain was not different. People who had had mindfulness training, it changed. Instead of using the language centers, they were using the sensation centers, the body sensation centers. So this is not just a matter of, oh, it's different language of people doing the same thing. This is the fact that people are using their brains differently when they are doing the neo-traditional or the embodied kind of mindfulness. So if we have a change in brain state and a change in experiential state, this might enable us to define mindfulness as a state of consciousness. Now, state of consciousness is a term that's used a lot, but there's, again, different meanings for it. And you'll notice through this process that there's this division between kind of one set of definitions and another set of definitions. So there is one approach which considers the ordinary kind of get up in the morning and talk to myself through the whole day, that kind of consciousness as baseline, as normal, as the only way that you can actually connect with reality, and that every other state of consciousness is an aberration. And so in the literature that holds it that way, you will see that the term state of consciousness is applied to things like comatose state, vegetative state, lethargic state, psychotic state, dissociative state, intoxicated state. Then there is a different approach which is actually more representative of most human cultures for most of history, which is that there are different states and different ways to be, and that they give us different kinds of information that are valid. So we're going to call that polyphasic, following Charlie Laughlin, so those of you who don't know him. And so this group usually considers that altered states are pathological. Ones that recognize multiple versions says, well, you know, altered states can be beneficial, some of them. Meditative states, trance states, mystical states, psychotropic, transcendent, hypnotic states can all play a role in the right context in a process of healing. So mindfulness is a great example of a shifted state of awareness that has been shown through research to have beneficial qualities. And it is actually the first instance within psychology where we have this kind of clear evidence that a shifted state of consciousness has a beneficial effect. So, most of psychology, the way we have it today, is situated around the norm of kind of that ego state, like we were talking about. Oh, did I leave my keys? I need to get milk on my way home. Oh my goodness, did you hear the latest news? Chat, 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 chat. That's normal. That's the kind of psychology. We have a psychology whose baseline is that way of being. Transpersonal psychology began as a study of those states that were outside of that sort of limited conception of self. And it began as a beyond ego psychology. So what are all of these capacities? Meditation, non-ordinary states, spirituality, healing, transformation. What are those? Transpersonal psychology began with that question. And so you had a division, if you will, between standard psychology and a transpersonal approach. But over time, as the field has matured, what you have now is, you know what, if we add these other things in, if these capacities are part of what we have access to, it changes the notion of who the human person is. And so if who we are is different, then a transpersonal approach is really an approach to a whole person psychology that doesn't reject what we know from cognitive behavioral neuroscience. That's all good information, but puts it in the context that is larger. Now, one of the things that's happened in psychology is that we've taken the things that were easy to measure and we have treated them as if they were more important, which is kind of like the old story of the guy who's looking for his keys under the street lamp, even though he lost them somewhere else because, well, he can see here. Right? These other aspects are harder to study, but often they are more important. Let me ask you to think back about some of the major decisions and the turning points in your life. Were those turning points about, gee, I just suddenly thought of this in a new way? Or were they about some profound felt experience? Whether it was a mystical experience or falling in love or an intuition or something that you suddenly knew for no particular external reason or something that you felt in your body. Which one of those has more impact? How many of you said to yourself, well, you know, it was just I had a reframe. I had a mental reframe, and that's what changed my life? Well, not too many hands. How many had a different kind of felt experience that had impact and made a difference in, okay, a lot more hands on that. That's what matters to us. That's what shapes our lives. That's what shapes our societies and cultures. And yet we have largely left it out of psychology because it's hard to measure. So, how do we apply this? How can beneficial states of consciousness be understood better if we use a whole person approach? Well, let's talk about attention. Instead of consciousness, that's such a big word, I don't even know what that means. Let's talk about attention. And let's talk about it in the conventional way. If you go to psychology, it'll say, okay, attention is the cognitive process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment while ignoring other things. Okay, it's good. Now let's ask a different question. Where is attention? Now, a conventional way of answering that might be, well, the thing that I'm looking at. My attention is on the cat. My attention is on something in the room. That's how we usually think of it. But notice that attention doesn't just go to something. It comes from somewhere. It comes from somewhere in your body. And of course, in mainstream Western culture, that's usually the head. So I'd like you to just notice right now, where is your attention coming from? When you're watching the slides, you're listening to the presentation, where are you sitting in your body? Is it your kneecap? Probably not. Probably somewhere up here. Right? That's how most of us do it most of the time. So we have cartoons, and in the thought bubbles, they're usually coming out of the head because that's where I am when I'm thinking. And that's where the attention comes from in our ordinary experience. Now, that attention can come from other places. And these other places correlate with changing your state of consciousness. So in order to change your state of consciousness, you've got to change where your attention comes from. You want to do it? Want to try it? Okay. All right. So what I'd like you to do is just nothing, really. Just start breathing. I'm sure you've all been holding your breath until now. And start noticing the sensations of your breathing. And what I'd like you to do is notice the sounds in the room. Notice, oh, there's some guy talking. And then there's some background noise you can hear, the air circulating. And notice where the sound is coming. Sound is probably arriving at your ears. And now what I'm going to ask you to do is to imagine that that sound is arriving at the center of your chest instead of in your ears. Just imagine that you can feel that sound, all the pieces of it, arriving at the center of your chest. And as it arrives at the center of your chest, I'd like you to imagine that instead of drawing the breath through your nose, that you are here in the center of your chest, receiving the breath, releasing the breath. And now the part of you that's watching from your eyes or your face, I'm going to invite you to let it go. And let it slide down and be here in the center of your chest along with the breath. Okay. Did anybody notice a shift in the amount of thinking they were doing? Get a little quieter? Did you have to fight to make that happen? Or did it just happen when you shifted? Great, good work. So the way of taking this very subtle change and putting it into scientific psychological research, one of the ways is, this was a student dissertation where the student took 28 endurance athletes, people who are used to, people who've had experience being in a flow state because they're running 25 miles 3 times a week, or they're biking 100 miles a day, and asking them, first of all, to read a news story and say, so where are you in your body when you read a news story? And you can see that the result is they all reported being in their head. Now, where are you when you're in flow? Nowhere near the head. Sitting in the heart and a little bit forward. So here's a way of taking these very subtle differences, the difference between what it felt like to be in your head, yap, 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 and what it felt like to be in the heart area and noticing the quiet that came with it. So we're able to take that and turn it into something measurable. Call these phenomenal markers of attention, just to make it sound like, you know, psychology, and also to use the kind of precision that you need when you're doing research. Another set of researchers in Finland have done similar kind of work, but with emotional states. In other words, the question being, well, if you're just feeling something in your body, isn't that just subjective? Well, actually, over samples in 2 different cultures, they found remarkable consistency in how people reported the sensations of their body associated with anger, fear, disgust, happiness, sadness, surprise, neutral state, envy, shame, pride, contempt, depression, so on and so forth. These are the subtle cues that our bodies give us, and if we can find ways to bring that into psychological research, we can start to take some of those subtle things that are actually more important and bring them into the psychology conversation. We just recently did a small pilot study. I'm not giving you all the results here, but what we found was using different attentional postures, focused in the head, focused in the chest, focused in the belly, created consistent changes. Now, you may go, oh, well, yeah, sure, okay, fine. And of course, it's just one subject. But finding correlations between EEG measurement and people doing things with their minds is not easy. If you give people task A and task B, mental task, and you put the EEG, most of the time you don't see any difference. Most of the time, in order to see any difference at all, and you're lucky if you find it, is you got to take like 30 people and have them do the different tasks, and then you use complex statistical analysis to tease out, and you say, oh, well, yeah, there's a little difference. So the fact that we were, with a single person, able to see patterns here is no small thing. Not only that, but the trial-on-trial correlation, now what that means is the first time the subject does it, and the second time the subject does it, and the third time the subject does it, what's the correlation? Now, most of the time, there's no correlation. You can't see anything at all. A perfect correlation would be 1.0. The people analyzing this data estimated the trial-on-trial correlation at 0.98. Off the charts in terms of compared to what you usually get. And for those of you who are interested in statistics, we did get on some of the components, we did get statistical significance particularly on the low alpha. So, the attention posture of mindfulness takes the attention out of the head, brings it down to the belly. It takes that sense of me, the one that we usually have in our heads, and it moves it down into the belly and then turns it into a quality of warmth and presence that fills the body and some of the space around the body. So let's try that. And see how it feels. So what I'd like you to do is take a couple deep breaths and just notice what it feels like to breathe. Notice what the clothing feels like on your skin. Notice what it feels like to have the chair supporting your weight. And now, I'm going to ask you to take that experience that you had before, just call it back and imagine that you can feel yourself sitting as a little point of light in the center of your chest. And as you sit here in the center of your chest, imagine that the sounds are arriving here. The sound of my voice, the sound of the air circulation system, using your breath, drawing the air in to the center of the chest and then releasing it. And if there's part of you that's watching from behind your eyes, if your eyes are closed tight, just soften the way that you're holding them. Whatever the part of you is going, oh yeah, I see it down there, let go of that part and let it slide down into the center of your chest. And be that little point of light that you imagine right here in the center of your chest. Receive the sounds here. Receive the sensations of your body here. Be the point of light in the center of your chest that receives the breath, that draws the air and releases it back out. And now imagine that this little point of light that you are is in the center of your chest. Imagine instead of a point of light, that's a little pot of golden honey. And let that little pot of honey tip over and be that golden radiant honey that flows down the front of your spine, deep in the core of your body, down between the lungs, behind your digestion, down into the low belly, but deep in at the front of your spine. Find a comfortable place here, deep in your body, deep in your low belly. A comfortable place to kind of sit. Receive the sounds in the room here. I'm almost sorry we don't have any more of the construction noise, because it's great when you have something like that and you can just ride it in. You can use it to carry yourself into a deep place in your body. But the air conditioning will work fine. So receive the sound of the air conditioning. Be the point of light in the middle of the low belly that receives that whoosh of the air moving. It receives the sounds of the people around you, sound of my voice, whatever you're hearing. And as you breathe in, with each inhale, imagine that you bring yourself to focus at that point of light. And as you exhale, imagine that the radiance from where you sit begins to shine out and illuminate the space of your belly and your low back. Feel it. Feel the radiance as it expands out into the space of your belly, the space of your pelvis, the space of your low back and your hips, your chest, down to the knees and up to the shoulders, being that point of light in the middle of the belly, bringing to focus on the inhale and releasing that radiance on the exhale, not just in front of you and to the sides, but also into the space behind you. Feel the space all around your body. And let that radiance expand out to below your ankles, above your jaw. Notice the sound of the phone and receive it in your belly. It's just as good as anything else to help you meditate. Let the sound in. Be the point of light that receives it. On the exhale, let yourself radiate out into the space of your whole body and out several feet. Every side, including to the space behind you. Now, instead of being that sharp point of light in the belly, I'd like you to just allow it to soften. Allow yourself to soften in the belly, about the size of a volleyball. Soft in the belly. Be the belly that breathes. Be the belly that releases. Breathe in, release out. Let the radiance fill your body and the space around you for several feet. Feel the space behind you. What does that feel like? And don't think about it, just notice it. Just notice it. Let the awareness, what that feels like, come to you. All right, so no need to shift out of this, but if you want to open your eyes, if they're closed, just open them with soft focus. Just stay connected with our conversation here. I'm going to guess it probably wasn't too difficult to hold a quiet mind. You didn't have to step outside of your thoughts. You didn't have to repeat your thoughts over and over again. You shifted yourself into a state where those things were natural. So mindfulness as a state of consciousness is not just some kind of cognitive process, however helpful that may be. It's a shift from a cognitive state to a radically embodied state. Shifting the source of attention into the body is what I call radical embodiment. Now, why do I use the term radical embodiment? Because embodied mind is a big term these days. I got an article a few months ago that said 6 definitions of embodied mind. What were those 6 definitions? One of them was, well, you know, the brain is connected to the whole body. It's still in charge, it still runs everything, it's still the cognitive center, but It's connected to everything. Okay, that's not really what we're talking about. Another one was, oh, well, the body sends information to the brain. The whole body sends information to the brain. Okay, the brain is still the main player. It's still in charge. Not what we're talking about. The third one was talking about information being processed in other parts of the body. But the kind of information, when I read it carefully, what it was saying was that different parts of the body get trained, kind of like a rat in a cage, very much stimulus response. So that it gets associations. Oh, last time I felt this, the outcome was bad, so let's not do that. As opposed to sort of intelligent, perceptive information processing. So none of the main definitions of embodied mind are talking about a shift in state of consciousness. They are talking only about the fact that the brain is connected and interactive with the rest of the body, not that you can have a shift in awareness where your sense of yourself shifts out of your brain, out of your head, and into other parts of your body. So when you hear the term embodied mind, I used to read that term and go, oh, see, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about embodiment. How cool. Probably not. So that's what I use the term radically embodied. It's just what Amrit was saying in our previous session about how the autonomic nervous system is considered to just be sort of on autopilot, just sort of a mechanical process instead of an intelligent perceptual process that has a way to engage intelligently with information, and that we can actually use these parts of us to learn and to discern and to make good decisions. Those of you who may be acquainted with Eugene Gendlin, who did focusing work, recently passed away, used the focusing process, which he didn't use the term embodiment, but it was also a process of bringing the awareness down into the belly. And he used it to do processes where people would open up their creativity. If you want to think out of the box, get out of your head. Nothing wrong with the head. It's great. And actually, this is really about learning to use all of your resources. Learning how to navigate. How do you go from one to another? How do you get to the state that's going to work for what you're doing now? So, back to where we started, which is, what is immediately present in experience that is not being noticed? How many of you, before coming today, noticed that your attention was usually coming from your head, as if that was something that could be changed? Probably not a whole lot of you. Okay. So, as you shift into an embodied state, you get something to compare with. And you start to be able to experience that this thing that is right in front of you all the time has structure. Presence, we just kind of wake up and we go through the day and we're always looking out with our attention. We're not looking back and asking, oh, what is this thing? What is this process? Where is this process? How does this process change if I shift myself somewhere else? I remember the first time I had this experience. I was walking by a mirror, and as I was just scanning by, I noticed, oh my, look at that. I could, in the reflection, I could notice that I was sitting in my head. And I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. I wonder if that could move. And I thought, nah, that's silly. It'll be just like when I tried to bend spoons. You know, sat there with a spoon. Okay. Same spoon, nothing happened. And so as I watched that place that I could kind of perceive that I was in the mirror, I thought, okay, let me just kind of imagine this can go down. And it started to move down. And I was like, oh my God, I better stop. I might break something. Because it's not a familiar thing. It's not a familiar question to ask. Mindfulness opens your perceptions so that you can start to notice things about your experience that you couldn't notice before. Subtle things, just like me opening the fridge and not being able to see anything. So we're in our presence all our time. We are our present. We are our attention all the time. But we're so busy looking at things out in the world that we don't learn anything about it. Mindfulness is a way, as we learn to shift that attention, that we also becomes a tool where we can learn about that attention, where we can learn. You can learn how to be you in a different way. And you can learn about that process. And as we practice being, kind of activating other parts of us, those capacities change and shift and open. Now, how can this kind of approach help neuroscience? Well, I'm going to use the metaphor of a tropical rainforest. Now, if you fly over it, all you're going to see is the treetops. You're not really going to see very much of what's going on. And this is kind of like the cognitive view of our minds. Got thoughts, words, pictures, stories. That's the contents that we usually see of our minds. But if you look at the rainforest from the side, you see there's a canopy, and there's this big space in between, then you got the forest floor down here. And if we kind of take that as a metaphor, the canopy is that cognitive level. The forest floor is the biological, the neurons, the tissues, the chemicals. And cognitive neuroscience comes and says, great, let's figure out how the forest floor produces the canopy without looking at the stuff in between. Which is one of the reasons that it's difficult, because you try to measure what's going on here and correlate it with what's going on up there. It doesn't work so well. Cognitive neuroscience has got a lot of great stuff going on, a lot of great findings. Just making that connection there, few little breakthroughs here and there, but generally you can't kind of go, oh, well, yeah, we now kind of know how all of this stuff creates your everyday experience. Not really. So what's in between the canopy and the forest floor is the understory. That's where 90% of the animals live. The mammals, the birds, the reptiles, they all live in the understory. That's where the life is. So, in the metaphor, you've got the biologics and you've got the cognitives, but what about the part that's lived experience that's underneath the story? What's underneath kind of like your narrative about who you are? The narrative that's playing in the mind all the time. What about those subtle felt experiences? So, it may be, as with these attentional postures, that some of these aspects that are in the lived experience, not quite at the abstract level of cognitive experience, can help to fill in the gap. The meditation, the embodiment, the spirituality, the inspiration, the presence, the flow. And these may be part of what will help a cognitive neuroscience actually solve some of the problems and the challenges of trying to understand. And as long as those parts are missing, not only does it impoverish our psychology, but it may even prevent us from finding some of the solutions that we are looking for. So, questions? Been talking for a while, doing a few exercises. Stuart.
Thanks, yeah, firstly, this is like the third time I've had a chance to hear you do a very well thought out presentation instead of just trying to solve problems in the moment in different meetings that we've been in. And I'm just thank you for all the work that you put into it.
Thank you.
And you're very welcome. And what I go back to the beginning of your talk, where to me it was like, if anybody says you can experience these mystical things, you're crazy, right?
Right.
And if you're not just functioning as an ego,
Mm-hmm.
you better be careful. You know, so what I'm tracking in one dimension is how transpersonal psychology expanded, so we could not have to use the word crazy to invalidate, really.
Right.
All kinds of ways people at least describe their experience. They can say that they thought that God spoke to them and not be thought of as delusion.
Right.
And, you know, maybe they validly, who knows, up to the great creator. But what I kind of got interested in at the end about embodiment, because you're sort of opening the door, how far can we go, and claiming belly consciousness
Mm-hmm.
without being called, you know, odd.
Right.
You know, and so
Delusional.
Pardon me?
Delusional.
Yeah. You just quickly pathologize. And so what struck me was DNA. What do you think it would take for science, let's say, to say, well, yeah, belly consciousness is no longer crazy, but we can feel our DNA. And why I picked the word DNA is because I think it relates to something that Buddha was talking about, the different sheaths of our makeup,
Mm-hmm.
flesh body and energy body and so on, because the causal body, I think, might be related to DNA.
You know, these are all questions that currently are outside of anything we can study. And what I see as a possible way forward is that being able to define and measure states of consciousness and situate them relative to the ordinary thinking state will give it a location. Because right now, the way psychology runs, it kind of takes, as I said, takes that cognitive thinking state as the baseline. That's reality. When you're in that state, you're in touch with the reality. When you're not in that state, you're at some remove from reality. And if we can develop this out and really explain and measure states of consciousness, not just as cognitive process, but as shift in the mode from which we do cognitive processes, then it gives a context where you can say, okay, we've got this state, right, that's the one we think is normal, okay. Now we've got this state and we can actually measure it and we can say, this is how it relates to that state. Let's see what happens in this state. Now we've got some connection back. Because I used to be frustrated with the closed-mindedness of scientific approaches. And through the years of seeing a lot of poorly done studies that kind of like they're aspirational, but they really are, they're really full of holes. I've sort of come full circle and go, you know what? There's something real that happens here. And we have to approach it carefully. We have to do good work. We can't just say, oh, well, I believe this is true, so I'm going to do something to try to prove it. No, we actually have to come to our own beliefs and be willing to go, okay, my experience is totally lined up with this, but let me design a study that's good enough that it'll poke a hole in my belief if there's a problem. And that's what we haven't done. So if we can start there, I don't know how far we can go, but I'm sure we can start. If we can get to the place, so for example, the Newman Ma'a study showing that felt experience of different emotions is consistent across cultures and across hundreds of subjects, is meaningfully consistent. Wow, that's amazing. These subtle pieces of information that we're picking up and often not even noticing are meaningful. If we can show that where attention sits, that we can feel, is meaningful, now that subtle level of information, all of a sudden we've opened that up. How much more we can get in a measurable way, I don't know. But I think it's an open door. Yes?
So right now, for example, in physics, it seems like science is hitting almost like a glass wall where we just can't move forward because there's certain things that we just can't prove and understand.
So there are certain things we can't prove and understand. Can you give me an example?
Like string theory. String theory
Okay.
is something that is undeveloped and makes a lot of sense, but we can experimentally prove.
Right, because it's too small.
Yeah, it's just.
How are you going to test it?
Yeah, we can't physically prove it.
Right.
Same with quantum physics. There's a disconnect between that and the grand scale of physics, like astronomical physics. Do you think that is kind of what's happening in psychology? Because psychology by itself means the study of the psyche.
Right.
And if you're trying to transcend the psyche, how can you analyze it from the psyche itself?
So I'm going to turn your question around just a little bit, and you tell me if that feels real to you, if that distorts your question, or if that's. What if instead of trying to step out of the psyche in order to describe the psyche, we are stepping outside of our culture-bound definitions of psyche? Because, like I said earlier, most cultures throughout the world and through most time, from the evidence that we have been cultures that used more than one state of mind, which means that they were engaging the world in a different kind of way. And so coming out of the whole history of Western thought with, the church being in charge and then science kind of sneaking in from the Islamic world and getting a foothold, but the only way it could survive was go, well, okay, church folks, you studying the important stuff, the soul, the mind, intelligence, God, that's all yours. We're just studying the little dead stuff that God made, right? They had to do that in order to survive, in order to not be arrested. Okay, so that was the compromise. And so there's a historical basis, there's a cultural basis for why we are where we are. And so if we can, here's the thing, do we want science to be empirical, that is based on evidence, or do we want science to be based on the limitations that were created by our cultural history? And if we can recognize that the definition that we have of mind is actually a product of that cultural history, then maybe we can step back and say, well, actually, no, we want science to be empirical. That means these cultural assumptions, they're not empirical. Why would we want to use those as limits? At least in the questions that we ask. Because right now, it's difficult. If you want to get empirical evidence and you want to go to a laboratory, and you ask a question that doesn't fit within the cultural norms, like, oh, well, I'm sorry, no, there's been no research in this area, and that research question doesn't make any sense, so I'm sorry, we're not going to let you do that. Okay, so there's an effective control there. But if we can even just ask the questions and say, well, maybe that assumption about what our mind is has been limited and fettered by our cultural history, and maybe that's not scientific. I don't know. Does that address? Okay.
Maybe it's outside of the realm of science, because if someone experiences a God, or they have some sort of mystical experience, to themselves that's validating enough. So there's no need to further research that, because to you it's real. So do we truly need to intellectualize consciousness, for example, or should we just teach that it works and try for yourself, see that it works, and then you'll have the experience of what it is to be conscious, to be aware, to be in these states?
So I'm not sure that it's an either or. So Buddhism, for example, takes exactly that approach. It says, look, I'm not, go and test it for yourself. Go and spend your life doing this and see how it works out, which is a very clever sales pitch, actually. And at the same time, we live in a scientific society. We have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have the kinds of experiences that are generally marginalized in psychology and who don't have any validation or context or way to be met with those experiences. Our psychology doesn't have a lot of room for them. Well, the thing is, it's like we call them sometimes exceptional human experiences. But if you get any group, I would wager that if we had that conversation in this room, we would find that those kinds of experiences are not exceptional at all. We call them exceptional because they're outside of our cultural they're outside of our cultural conversation. It's like, oh, well, I don't want anybody to think I'm crazy, but I had this thing happen. I had someone who called me up who was in great distress, who had been jogging and a bolt of lightning hit nearby, and all of a sudden was able to feel cell phone towers and found it, very disturbing. Of course, all his friends thought, like, oh, well, we better take this guy, But, it's like I was able to talk to him and say, you know what, these kinds of things happen. This is not outside of the range of what people experience.
I know that in South America, for example, in certain tribes, indigenous tribes there, when someone in the tribe is what we would call schizophrenic, they consider it as a great gift from the spirit world and a connection to that world, and kind of like as a visionary that can guide help the shaman guide the tribe.
It's integrated in culture in a very different way. Yeah.
Well, we do have some scientific means of validating some of these things.
Absolutely.
One of the things that intrigued me from way back was when EEG machines were hooked up to an English healer and to the person she was healing. And she raised her hand when she thought it was a connection, and their EEGs synchronized.
Right.
And her EEG was very high amplitude and slow. And his turned in to high amplitude and slow from being very disorganized. And I've experienced the same thing myself, and I sort of know what that is to have a high amplitude, low frequency EEG. And it seems like that, and now we have the MRIs and things that can really validate these kind of experiences. Yes, and there are pieces, there are studies here and there, okay. But in the main, because the results of those studies are not consistent with our cultural beliefs, even those studies get marginalized. Some of the studies are not well done, they're not well designed, and it's like that has to be acknowledged. It's like, no, this isn't prejudice, this is a poor study, okay. Other studies are good, but it's like, well, nobody wants to deal with it because it's outside of our cultural beliefs. So it's like,
this has to be addressed. You have to kind of you have to kind of go back and go, well, there's a cultural issue here, there's a philosophical issue, and address it at that level instead of just, hey, here's some things that don't fit. Oh yeah, we don't want to hear about that. Yes?
Something I'm finding out today, I'm very frustrated because everybody was so intellectually doing all this today. It was very much in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been just diagnosed with Hashimoto.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thyroidism, which is
Yeah.
a step further. This actually gave me some kind of hope. Because I felt, I'm always feeling so frustrated, not remembering names. And yet I can remember way back when I learned how to drive a car.
Yeah, yeah.
So now I'm looking at when I'm kind of going, I'm starting to get emotional.
It's all right.
It makes me feel a little better, but maybe I need to stop focusing so hard on what I can't do.
Yeah.
And remember all of these things I've done in the past that were going swimming in Central America and taking my daughter and watching her with the shrimp and seeing the joy in her face
Yeah.
and watching the creatures melt. She wasn't in her head like, oh, this is so magical. She was like experiencing it. And it kind of gives me the feeling like, well, there's something besides always remembering your name. That I've still got some value.
And there's all of,
I don't know if that sounds totally crazy, I'm sorry.
so here's what I hear.
But I had some emotional things as you were talking in this canopy and forest tree
Yeah.
thing, like, wow.
Here's what I hear. What I hear you saying, I have other resources that are part of my mind too that work just fine. And I can use those.
Yeah.
Great.
So, thank you.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Yes?
I'm curious as to whether you're familiar with the work of Dr. Valerie Hunt, who studied
Yes.
the human energy field, and if you think that her research was done by good scientific standards?
You know, I haven't reviewed her studies. I'm aware of her work. This is such a new area. I know that she was studying, like, each person has a unique signature and so on and so forth. But this is such a new area, and we don't have the opportunity to have lots of people replicate it because so few people will even touch it. So, and that's one of the reasons that with this work, I've started back with states of consciousness, rather than trying to go farther as like, well, here's something that's close to where the field is. Here's something that can help give us context for some of these other kinds of experiences. So back to your point, if I may, you know, we have on the one hand what something means to somebody, but on the other hand, we have people across different cultures and different communities who have similar kinds of experiences, and if we can learn more about that and how to better help people find those experiences if they're positive and valuable ones, it seems to me that's worth something too. That's not about saying, oh, well, you know, I can study what it means. I mean, each person's going to have their own interpretation. That's always true, right? Yes?
So what you're saying, it really reminds me of, I took psychology and close relationships, and like not too long ago, it was absolutely absurd to study like romantic relationships. Like people
Right.
thought it was crazy because it's a mystical experience, don't ruin it, and you know, are you meaning something like valuable to me? Why does it have to be studied? And now there's like tons of self-help books, and there's marriage counselors, and like, you know, it's just come a long way. I think like in the 60s or something is when people started studying it, like psychologically.
Right.
So I think that's like a prime example of that. There's like evolution. People thought that was crazy. Like, so I don't know. It like gives me hope and stuff. And I think like just because something is like, I don't know, like a profound or like mystical experience to someone doesn't mean it's not like worthy of study, like beneficial.
And sometimes you want to make, for one thing, you want to make sure that the way you're studying it is not distorting it, right? So if you want to, you know, study a very shy animal in the rainforest and you march in with a big loud expedition, you're going to discover that it no longer lives there because you scared it off.
I was actually going to ask if you were, when you first like delved into the world of transpersonal psychology, you were hesitant neuropsych, but it's so hard to find like faculty to like research anything literal. You know, it's so frustrating.
You know, it's like any time you're, basically it has to be important enough to you that it just doesn't make any sense to do anything else. If I were to gone to do, you know, Cal Berkeley and done cognitive neuropsych, I couldn't do it because it just doesn't have enough meaning. I respect the work, and I want to read the findings, and I want to learn about it, but for me to be only in that field wouldn't work. So it's kind of like how important, how front and center is it? And you know, and you want to have a good grounding in the psychology that we have already as well. Because if you want to take the field forward, you kind of need to know where it is also. Okay. Yes.
I can see why people look at the brain and how it's changing when you're meditating and stuff, but I'm wondering if people have ever examined the blood, because when I do meditation, particularly the breathing exercises and blowing out, I literally feel this tingling like it's cleaning out toxins out of my blood. Whenever the stress hormones are there, I feel like it's changing the blood when you do that. And I'm just curious. Well, it's a little more invasive, but it would be really interesting to see if the blood is changing.
It would be very interesting. You know, I think that kind of like, and so, you know, you have heart math that's working on the electromagnetic sort of properties of what happens around the heart. The neurotransmitters that are associated with the heart as well as with the gut. So you have EKG, you now have EGG, which can measure the gut. Sure. And that's, you know, that's kind of where the field is now. And there's still a lot to be studied. And as there get to be sort of better baseline models, because right now even meditation is not that well understood, I think those would be very interesting and important areas to branch out into. But you kind of have to start somewhere, and that's kind of where it has started. So it probably would be a little while before those kinds of questions would start to be asked, but it's certainly worth asking. Thank you. Yes?
Researchers pursue research in these more traditional meditation practices while still maintaining integrity and respect towards those traditional practices. And have you had any experience with like approaching those sorts of communities and what the responses might be?
So I think it's the same as with any cross-cultural challenge, which is you need collaborative teams. You need teams of people who are immersed in the experience, and you need teams of people, you need some people on the team who are not. And it's through that kind of dialogue that you can come to good research design. That's what my sense is. It's the same thing if, so for example, if you have people in one, let's say, you know, sort of dominant culture here, studying some subculture and not including anybody from that culture on the research team, it's like, no, that's not, you can't do that. And I think it's the same thing with these cultures around practice. All right, yes?
How does the work that you're doing and talking about connect up with the somatic experiencing sort of way?
Okay. Sure. Peter Levine's work, Somatic Experiencing, certainly has to do with embodied experience as well. And you know, one of the things that happens is when you enter an embodied state, stuff comes up. You're kind of going into parts of your mind that you haven't been aware of. So the emotional things that are associated with the part of your mind that you haven't been aware of, you'll likely run into them. And so Peter Levine's work, the way I understand it, really deals with that process of saying, okay, let's do that. Let's find those things. Let's find them in the body. And that's another part. So what we were talking about here, what we're focusing on, was really shifting the state of consciousness and looking at mindfulness particularly and as a shifted state of consciousness, not just as cognitive process, as a change in how you be, right? And somatic experience and other kinds of processes, focusing, for example, are ways to deal with what you encounter when you enter that territory. Okay. So in that way, mindfulness can be a wonderful adjunct to psychotherapy, because it helps you uncover the things that are not present in your story about yourself, but may be driving that story. All right. Sabina, what time are we? Okay. All right. One more question. Yes?
If you say, like, your explanation, or at least personal belief, would you say that the mind is, or would you believe, are you a monist or a dualist as it comes to the mind? Because I hear your research, or just your talk, and I'll hear some of each, and I'm trying to like pin down.
So, to me, the world is what it is. It's not automatically divided up into anything. And at the same time, when you start dealing with parts of it, sometimes in order to understand it, you have to divide it into parts. So I think monist and dualist lenses can all be useful as long as you recognize that they're all constructed.
What does that mean, monist and dualist?
Oh, monist, so kind of like, is the world divided into subject and object?
Okay.
Is it like, oh, this is me in here, and I'm private and separate from the world out there?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first time that I started feeling the space around me, and I started feeling the walls in the space around me, I was like, whoa. Wait a minute, I was doing something internal here. And so why am I feeling something? No, I'm just doing this internal thing. I'm just doing this meditation thing. And so that's private. It's like nobody can feel that, and I can't feel things out there, but why do I feel the wall every time I go over here? Right? So it was like, oh, maybe when you go really inside, you're actually connected with the outside. And so part of your question is like, part of it I think is in what state of mind are you in? So if you're in an ordinary thinking mind, a dualistic frame is kind of useful because it feels like it's me in here and the world out there. And that's a really useful frame. I don't knock it. It's a pragmatic frame. It's great for solving a lot of kinds of problems. But then when you shift to a different state, it's like, well, actually, inside and outside, not quite as different as I thought. So, is that helpful at all, or?
I was kind of thinking it more as in like there is some aspect, like, is your consciousness 100% a result of your mind? That is what I meant by that's kind of what I meant by like Cartesian like dualism versus like.
Is your consciousness 100% the result of your mind?
Versus as like a 100% material versus like some sort of outside, you said, mystical force. And if you believe that, then like what evidence do you have to say like?
That's a question I don't know the answer to.
I was just wondering if this has any sort of like say into that. So.
Yeah, it's like, here's what I notice, and that is that neural measurement is really, really sensitive. If you flutter your eyelid, it makes a big signature. If you change what you're doing with your mind, it makes a big change on what's happening. So there's a lot of interconnection between what your brain is doing and what your mind is doing. I think that's fair to say. The limits of that, or, I don't know. That's.
So you would say then that, like, because I know in a lot of like modern, like neurobiology, like consciousness is what the mind does.
Correct.
Like, so you would say like we can say we can like all the things that we associate mind body are true in but we're not looking at perhaps like the whole picture of that research.
Well, so here's one way I would expand it, and that is, so when you have the brain, what do you have? You have neurons in a network, and you have neurohormones. You got those three things. You can't actually measure whether consciousness is there or not, but you've got those three things that give you a clue that something's going on. Okay. In the rest of the body, you have neurons, you have networks, and you have neurohormones. So why wouldn't, if we are making the assumption that there's consciousness in the head, why wouldn't we make the assumption that it might be elsewhere as well? Maybe instead of just the brain here, the cortical brain, maybe we have a whole body brain. And maybe that will help, and that's a sort of a step right there, that there's evidence where you could argue for it, but it's not solid yet. But maybe that would help to explain some of the things that aren't easily explained by just brain activity.
I don't have a question, but I did want to say I have been a spoon in my energy.
Oh, have you? You've been a spoon.
After an intense group class.
Oh, cool.
She has been what?
She bent a spoon. Yes.
Not physically.
Right, but you were able to.
My energy.
Cool. You'll have to teach me. Okay. Good. Thank you very much.